Welcome everybody. This is the MG Levine Lecture in Jewish Thought, hosted here by the Department for Jewish Philosophy of Bar-Ilan University. It's not the first one, but all of the lectures have been supported very generously by the Levine Foundation, and we want to thank the Levine Foundation also for this time supporting us here. We are very happy about our distinguished guest tonight, Rabbi Professor Grinberg, who will in a few minutes give the lecture. Before that, we have several greetings from distinguished Bar-Ilan professors, and after that we will have a short introduction by the most suitable person for that, Dr. Tanya Whyte, who has written her dissertation at our department about Rabbi Grinberg. So that is much better than if I would do this. I'm happy and honored to introduce to you the president of Bar-Ilan University, a person that we learned to appreciate even more during the last year of his engagement for this university, Professor Arya. Please say a few words.
Hey, thank you very much. First of all, we're very happy to have you here. We met before, but not before a lecture, so I'm really excited about what we're going to hear. I would like to thank also Dr. Daphna Levin from the Levin Foundation, Dov שוורץ, head of the department, sitting here, to you, Professor Cooler, Tanya Whyte, who will give an introduction, and Hanoch Ben Pazi, a good friend, who's been, we've been going a long way. He brought me to those lectures. I'm always supposed to say something smart, but there are so many smart people around me. I'm a chemist, I don't know anything about those. I'm a good listener though. And I know that you, and together with Blue, you have been involved very much in Jewish thought and in Jewish action, not only thought, also action. Starting in New York and today here in Israel, in variety of issues that are related to Jewish thought. And in this time when we pray so much for the end of the war, the return of all the hostages, our soldiers, the evacuees, there are many wounded people who are still in hospitals. It's really a good time to hear a little bit about what Judaism has to say in this respect, and I know that you will refer to that in your talk. So looking very much to hear from you, and I'm very happy that this tradition goes on despite the time, despite the period. Looking forward very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zaban. Our next speaker is the actual host of the evening, the Bala Bait, as we say in Hebrew, the head of the Department for Jewish Philosophy here at Bar-Ilan University, a recent Israel Prize winner, Professor Dov שוורץ. Please.
I'm very honored to welcome Rabbi Professor Grinberg, and I think this is the right time to hear from you, since Professor Cooler reminded about the situation, and I think that the voice of modern orthodoxy in US is very important for us, and you are one of the most distinguished leaders of the modern orthodoxy. You mentioned a few times your debt to Rabbi Soloveitchik, and I just say in a sentence that Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote in 1944 the book Halachic Mind. It was published only later. But I think that this book is the manifesto of modern orthodoxy. Because I won't go into the phenomenology of the text, but what Rabbi Soloveitchik states was that when we are talking about Jewish consciousness, the basic level of it is the objective consciousness. That means the mitzvot. And this is the starting point, And therefore, I think that this is the manifesto of modern orthodoxy. However, Yeats came and says that the most basic level is not the mitzvot, but it is the free will to choose the mitzvot. And I think that is the difference between the teacher and the student. And that means a lot to me and to us all. So I wish us all an intellectual experience, and I'm sure that at least I will learn a lot about what modern orthodoxy has to say about us here in Israel. Thank you very much for agreeing to come.
Thank you very much, Professor Schwarz, and that's really true. I mean, we were investing a lot of thought this year, especially this year, you know, which is so, special and tragic at the same time. And I mean, we don't need to hide the fact that many people didn't agree to come to Israel at this time. Professor Grinberg immediately agreed to speak to us, and I think, you know, if you look at the title of the lecture, Choosing Life, the Triumph of Life, this is exactly what we wanted to say this year, truest lecture. So before we start, there's one more speaker. We had this wonderful idea of asking Dr. Tanya Whyte to introduce Professor Grinberg, because she has written a whole dissertation on him. She is the expert, and that was just a perfect constellation. The dissertation was written at our department here at the Department for Jewish Philosophy, and as it always is, with the best plans and the perfect ideas, Tanya couldn't come here tonight because she has a family celebration, and that is really important. Mazal tov to Tanya. But, you know, we are living in the age of technology and, you know, virtual reality, so we have recorded her. Okay, so I apologize that it is a recording, but I think it's, you know, second best, very close to her, having her here, and this is what she has to say about our guest.
Being British, I think it's apt that I'm going to begin with an apology. Whilst I would have loved nothing better to be there introducing my mentor, rabbi, role model, and thought leader in person, that at present it's imperative to celebrate every we can, and therefore tonight I'm attending two smachot. However, I'm both humbled and happy that Hanoch asked me to introduce Rabbi Grinberg, or as his students know him, Rav Yitz, this evening, since it gives me the opportunity not only to explain why I believe his thought to be imperative at this time, but also to express a deep hakarat hatov to him for the insight and wisdom he has brought to me personally, and I know thousands of others. Rabbi Yitz Grinberg has a very full resume that includes hundreds of projects, articles and books, positions of importance and significant things he's achieved in the long span of his career as a Jewish leader. In his earlier years, he served as the Jewish chaplain of Brandeis University, the rabbi of Riverdale Jewish Center, an associate professor of history at Yeshiva University, and as a founder, chairman and professor in the Department of Jewish Studies at City College of New York. He is a world-renowned Holocaust theologian, a beloved rabbi and teacher, the president and founder of Klal, founding president of the Steinhardt Foundation, the executive director of the President's Commission on the Holocaust, which conceived and created the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., pioneer in interfaith dialogue between Jewish and Christian groups, and now the president of the J.J. Greenberg Institute for the Advancement of Jewish Life. He is also a senior scholar in residence at Hadar and on the faculty of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. Yet these accolades only scratch the surface of who Rav Yitz is. Rabbi Abraham Yoshua Heschel spoke about there being textbook and text people, things we learn from a book and things we learn through observing and watching a person. Rav Yitz is both. His thought, as you will hear this evening, is both profound and revolutionary. But perhaps even more inspiring is that he is a text person, someone who lives, breathes, and exemplifies the core ideas of his thought. He sees the Tselem Elokim in each human being and treats them with the utmost dignity and respect. He is humble yet assertive in his activism for Jews and non-Jews alike. The word mensch was created for him. His relationship with his wife Blue is nothing short of inspiring. their mutual reverence, respect and pride for each other, as well as their joint activism, spanning many decades, has made the world a better place. In terms of the textbook, his philosophy offers a novel and some might say radical reading of Jewish history and theology. In his recently released magnum opus, The Triumph of Life, which I recommend every person to read, he explores the Jewish journey and the relationship between man and God through the prism of covenant. He combines historical academic training, empirical insights, philosophical wisdom with an erudite Torah and Talmudic knowledge to create one of the most comprehensive theological histories of the Jewish people in contemporary literature. Rav Yitz is an evolutionary thinker. Being self-critical and deeply thoughtful, he has, over many years, revised, built on, and reformulated his theology. It also has not been without controversy. In his early essay of 1982, The Voluntary Covenant, he uses the image of a broken covenant to describe the relationship between God and his people in a post-Holocaust age. Being such a cataclysmic event, Rav Yitz argues God rescinds his side of the covenantal contract and therefore cannot demand anymore the subservience of his people to his law. However, instead of rejecting God, says Rav Yitz, the Jewish people respond by affirming their covenantal commitment. And thus, the covenant becomes what he terms voluntary. The image of the broken covenant was not taken too kindly by many within the Orthodox milieu into which he was situated, and he was the recipient of some harsh criticism. Over time, he constructs a far-reaching Jewish theology, in which he posits the relationship between the humans and the divine as part of a three-era covenantal development, in which humans are increasingly given more and more responsibility and freedom to uphold the divine mandate of life. That is why the Holocaust was so deeply shattering, because it was an assault not just on the Jews, but through its focus on dehumanization on the principle of life itself. Thus, Rav Yitz's early Holocaust theology, shaped in many ways by his own personal shock and shattering, is filled with images of burning children and the appraisal that nothing can or should be said theologically about the event. But over time, he begins to situate the event within a much wider context and offers a much more melioristic outlook. Today, Rav Yitz will share with you the foundation and principles that comprise this theology. However, I want to end with the following. For 7 years, I was immersed in researching Holocaust theology. Empirically and epistemologically, the Holocaust was an absolute shattering and a rupture, both for those that went through it and for many who lived in its shadow. On October the 7th, my generation had their Holocaust moment. And though we must be extremely cautious in comparing events, I know for myself and many others it was a total shattering, a cataclysmic moment of rupture. Not only because the images and the stories were so utterly horrifying and unimaginable, and not only because the event was so unprecedented in this generation, both quantitatively and qualitatively, perhaps even more profoundly, because it shattered so many of our accepted cognitive and theological assumptions. If Israel was the response to the Holocaust, a safe haven for Jews, where finally we could defend ourselves on our own sovereign soil, what happens when that dream dissipates before our eyes? If Israel, in the language of many religious Zionists, was the Athalta de Geula, the beginning of the redemption, and Zionism is the human response to the divine call, why does God not keep his side of the bargain as we kept ours? And yet, what we witnessed in the late hours of October the 7th and October the 8th onwards is precisely in line with Rav Yitz's theology. On the heels of a death-obsessed fundamentalist attack, we witnessed, in an almost counterintuitive manner, an entire nation rise up and affirm life in every way possible. Rav Yitz's thought kept me sane through some personal challenges I faced while writing my doctorate, and continues, and I think more than ever today, to be an edifying voice for myself and so many others in these tumultuous, unprecedented times we are experiencing. I am sure tonight he will do the same for all of you. So ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Rav Yitz to share, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, to share his thoughts and theology on the question of triumphing life tonight.
Okay, thank you very much, Tanya Whyte, for those really beautiful words, I think. And now, without further ado, we come to the main event of the evening, and that is our annual lecture in Jewish thought. I again repeat the title because it's so beautiful: Choosing Life, Biblical Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, and now Lay Judaism, a theological projection of the present Jewish condition. Please, we have to just switch the microphone. So if you want to be dramatic, then it's something.
Permit me, in the words of the famous speaker, before I begin to speak, I want to say a few words. And particularly, it's a privilege to be here at Bar Ilan, and I'm also a little bit in awe of the presence of people who I have read for many years with inspiration, Professor שוורץ, Professor Ephraim Meir, Tamar Ross, and so it's a privilege to have a chance to think aloud with you and to explore this idea tonight, and I thank you for the opportunity also to participate. The main focus of this annual lecture, if you will, is going to be arguing that we're living through a once in 2,000 years situation or experience. A new iteration of Judaism is being born, I believe, which, as I say, happens once in 2,000 years, or maybe not quite as much, but at least it's only happened, in my judgment, twice before in our history. So in the book, Triumph of Life, which Tanya kindly referred to, I just want to say again that there the argument is spelled out in much greater detail. I can only offer some outlines right now. By iteration, I mean, if one looks at the tradition as a kind of coherent, articulated, complex vision of life and of the purpose and goals of life and of history, that kind of iteration, which involves shared values and goals, but over the course of Jewish history has, in its particular iteration, has had all kinds of distinctive aspects, distinctive institutions, for example, distinctive spiritual leadership, distinctive cultural and other opportunities or influences and so on. Nevertheless, on al-regel achat, my claim is that we are living through what started in the first iteration as what is commonly now called Biblical Judaism, which roughly, again, sometime around 1500 BCE or a little closer in to the first century, is a kind of, I believe, despite enormous variations and changes, fundamentally a common, complex iteration of the tradition, followed by Rabbinic Judaism, which I believe can be dated from the first century of the Common Era down to modernity, 18th, 19th century in Eastern Europe, perhaps down to 1939. And this iteration, again, none of it happens overnight. Took 800 years, roughly, estimate, till the rabbinic understanding and version of the tradition won out among the Jewish people. But it is a kind of a whole, despite the variety of locations, and at least that's my argument. I'll come back to that in detail. What I think we're living through is the emergence of a third iteration. To me, or at least in the book I argue, it starts with modernity itself, with the onset of modernity, which I take to be, in fact, in all three cases, I believe there is a divine initiative which also expresses itself in what I call a divine tzimtzum, because the concept of brit, of covenant, says that the divine self-limits and concludes that they will not do it all, not make all the final decisions, final operation, but it welcomes human beings into a kind of a partnership, a brit, a partnership which, again, I argue in the book, is a partnership for repair of the world, the tikkun olam. But this particular third stage of the development, I believe, reflects, just as naming it from its peers and its surrounding culture, I'm guessing that in the end it'll be called something like lay Judaism because its leadership, I believe, will be lay rather than formally titled or sacramentally endowed leadership. It'll be called lay Judaism, I believe, also because the divine presence and the holiness will be primarily identified in secular and in the so-called secular settings and secular activities. So that's just a guess. You won't hold me to that, although I was tempted to say I predict that because you recall the Gemara's comment that since the Churban prophecy has passed from the Nevi'im and has gone to children and fools. So I think I qualify. So I'm tempted to say I predict, but I'll play it a little closer to the vest and say I guess, and we'll see what happens. So, but before I go into the specific details of the iteration, I'd like to give a short general outline of the theology of the total tradition, out of which the particular claim of iteration and concrete springs, as a kind of a general sketch of the Jewish tradition. So al regel achad, I would argue Judaism is the religion of life. Why? Because life is its highest value, because its goal is a world, or at least this planet, full of life, in which life is upheld and respected and treated as it deserves to be in the real world, in the actual, and not just in the imagination or the traditional texts themselves. And it starts at the beginning. God, the source of creation, the source of life, is a God of life, Elohim Chaim. God loves life. In creation, we see in the first chapter of Breshit, in the creation story, that every time life shows up, God responds in the same way. Vayavorach, a blessing, the very idea of blessing, it's a delight to God and expresses it in blessing, followed by Pruravu, give me more. The essential divine affirmation then is that life is a source of divine joy and divine fulfillment and purpose. Furthermore, that love for life is most developed and most expressed in the love for the most developed form of life. The most developed form of life, I always add, thus far, it's only a few billion years in, so who knows, but thus far the most developed form of life is the human being in the image of God. And in the words of Rabbi Akiva, Chaviv Adam shenivra b'tzelem, there's an extra precious love, concern that God has, because the human has reached such a level of development that they are called Tzelem Elokim, they are God-like. One could go on and on. God wants the world to be filled with life. Ishayahu's interpretation of creation, Lo tohu v'ra, it was not created to be empty or void. Lashevet yotzara, it was created to be filled with life. And in fact, in the Gemara's understanding of this, that in particular God calls upon the human to fill the world with life, and that's why, even though according to the mitzvah of Pruravu, one fulfills that having two children, the Gemara concludes that based on Lashevet, on the commandment to fill the world with life, one continues beyond 2 to 3, 4. Well, that's another whole conversation. So the human role is to fulfill that part of it, to fill it life. But even more important, it's not just quantity of life, but quality of life. And my argument is, again, you'll look at the Mishnah, and I try to explain it in the book. In the Mishnah, Lamed Zayin Aleph in Sanhedrin, the Mishnah instructs witnesses who are giving testimony in the case of capital punishment. That is to say, Tzelem Elokim is at stake on their witness, on their words. Therefore, as it were, they were put through a special ceremony to understand that the issue is not just telling the truth, but is telling the truth with full understanding of the incredible weight, dignity, and value of the life that is at stake in their words. And the Mishnah, I believe, therefore ends up saying that we are told the story of Adam and Tselem Elokim to teach us what I can call three fundamental dignities of every human being in the image of God. By being born in the image, one is endowed with this dignity. And the three dignities are infinite value, erech ein sofi, there is no limit to the value. That is to say, life is worth more than any amount of money, and no amount of money is too much to spend, to save, to heal, to take care of a human being in the image of God. And again, the contrast to a real world, I mentioned in the book one example in Africa. 1 million children a year die from malaria who could be saved if they were provided with mosquito netting that keeps the mosquitoes out. The mosquito netting costs $8, it lasts for 5 years. If you do the math, that means it's fractions of a penny per day. But we live in a world in which neither the governments nor the international community provides the money or the organization to save a child's life, even though it would only cost pennies. So that is the measure of the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be, and when it will be when it fully honors the image of God. A second example, of course, is Mishnah says that Tselem Elokim means every human being in the image of God is equal. There is no preferred image of God. God is not white, God is not black. God is not male, God is not female. Even more shocking, God is not Jewish and God is not a Gentile. The claim that a particular version, whether it's white or male or Jewish or non-Jewish, the claim that a particular version is the superior or accurate is in effect a form of idolatry, because it claims that a fixed image of God of a certain type is superior. But the point of Tselem Elokim is that every human being is in Tselem Elokim, and therefore every Tselem is equal to every other. The third dignity of every human being by being born human is uniqueness. Again, the Mishnah has a very powerful image, and it shows the Gedulato, the strength and the creative power of God. Because when a human being fashions coins or stamps or anything that is replicable, and they're made for one mold, each comes out the same as each other, as the other. Whereas this is God's greatness, all of humanity comes from one couple, and yet not one of them is same as the other. So the dignity of uniqueness, again, is a fundamental dignity. Now, of course, again, society can recognize the dignity, or it can suppress it. It can pass laws that blacks are slaves and are inferior. It can pass laws that Jews are non-citizens and inferior. But that is, again, the culture trying to suppress or deny a fundamental dignity of the human being b'tselem Elokim. And it can get away with it only to the extent that they have failed, or we fail as religious people, to communicate the truth of Tselem Elokim. So Rabbi Akiva adds, while it is a sign of human dignity and value that Hashem has created them in Tselem Elokim, Chiba Yotera, God expressed additional love, no doubt lo, to that in fact are at Tselem Elokim. And that, I argue, is the role of religion or of revelation, to communicate to everybody that they are, and to everybody else, that they are Tselem Elokim and are entitled to these dignities. Now, of course, we're living in a world where this is not practiced, not true. Here comes what I feel the conclusion of the religion of life, or the culmination, I should say. And the culmination of religion of life is that messianism. Again, I understand the dangers and the problems of messianism, but my argument is it is the culmination of the vision of religion of life. Why? Because messianism says that we will repair the world, we will correct it to the point where it will become a paradise, a Gan Eden. And that paradise, Gan Eden, is marked by the fact that there will be none of the enemies of life. So, in fact, God has called humans to join in this breed, in this covenant, in this partnership, to turn the world into a Gan Eden. And together they will do it. And of course, it can't be done in one generation, so it's a brit, a covenant, not just between God and humanity, Brit Noach, or between God and the Jewish people, Brit Sinai, Brit Avram, Brit Avos, but also it is a brit between the generations. Since my generation, no generation can fulfill the task alone, it depends on, there would be no way, no point starting if it didn't have this belief that after me, a future generation will take up. I can take it as far as I can, but in the end, it will not be finished in my lifetime. So it depends on, and that's part of my commitment and part of my understanding, that the next generation or future generations will take it up. Now, what will the Brit do? Simply overcome all the enemies of life. That's the vision. Overcome poverty, because poverty robs human beings of their value. They can't afford education, they can't afford medicine, they can't afford give the child freedom to grow, they have to send them away to labor, child labor. So poverty robs human beings of their dignity. So we'll have to overcome poverty, or in Yeshayahu's words, Kanachal Shotef, prosperity goyim will be like a flood. That's the kind of world we have to live in which we will be able to afford to treat every human being with the infinite value they deserve. One would have to overcome hunger. One would have to overcome oppression, inequality, discrimination. Again, Yeshayahu's words, V'shofat b'tzedek dalim. In the Messianic age, the Messiah will give, even the poor people will get tzedek and equal justice. Even in contemporary democracies, poor people generally don't get quite equivalent for the very simple reason that they're poor and they can't afford representation, don't have the connections. So yes, in effect, Yeshayahu is telling us that in this Messianic age, we'll overcome discrimination, we'll overcome sexism, which is the denial of Tzelem Elokim of women, we'll overcome anti-Semitism, the denial of the Tzelem Elokim of Jews, homophobia, which denies the Tzelem Elokim of gay people, and so on. So what the tradition predicts in Messianic vision is that in fact this world can be and will be repaired to that level where you will overcome all these enemies of life, leaving life triumphant. And again, these are minority viewpoints, but I think they're very crucial in the tradition. In words of Yeshayahu again, Bila hamavet lanetzach. He's predicting that death will be swallowed up in eternity. Now I must say, when I talk about overcoming death, I think twice and hesitate, and I realize there's a risky, almost sometimes anti-human attitude hiding behind the idea of human beings overcoming death. Not to mention that death at least gets rid of the tyrants sooner or later, whereas if they live forever, God knows where we'd be now. What if Stalin had not died in 1953? Nevertheless, my argument is we should take the Navi seriously, at least at the goal, or if you would prefer less pushing the limits, I tell people, if you think Bila Mavel Netzach is a little exaggerated, then I appeal to Yeshayahu in Perek Samach Hey, where he suggests, well, if we don't achieve total immortality, mortality, if we don't achieve that, well, Nar will extend life extension. Nar ben meyad shana yamut. So they'll die 100 years old, they're just a kid, because they'll live many more years. And again, either version. The reason I personally prefer to go for overcoming death itself is that I'm very moved and very impressed by Chazal's insistence on Tchiyat HaMeitim. It's one of the more uncomfortable moments in modern philosophy in general. I mean, the whole idea of not taking material death seriously somehow. It embarrassed almost all the denominations and to say it, but Chazal absolutely insisted upon it. And I think what they were trying to say was that our dream is not just to stop future death, to cure all sicknesses. Again, Yeshayahu, vision of it, blindness, the blind will see, the deaf will hear, the lame will dance. And if that sounds extreme, he nevertheless doesn't want to settle for that. In the end, Chazal say, Tchiyat HaMeitim means that if we really accomplished our dream, every death, every past defeat of life will be undone or reversed. And that's what the bracha of Elokim. And I want to remind you, they put it as the second bracha in the central tefillah, standing before God, and you say it 3 times a day, except on Yom Tovim and Chagim, where it's 4 or 5 times a day. So I think, again, I'd like to take Chazal seriously, at least push this as a vision. If not, you can judge what the probability or the percentages are to achieve it. Now, how are we going to do this? It is such a total transformation of reality. How does one seriously expect to do this? Is this just a fantasy? Is this just a dream that you have no intention of fully? No. And here's again this remarkable blend in Yahadut. Utopian, revolutionary, universal dream combined with a method of Brit, which is almost the opposite. Brit is particularist. It goes by God in a particular community or a particular generation or a particular humanity. It is particularist in the sense of it's much more focused on individual, Aniye Ircha Kodma, family comes first. You act on a human scale. The whole thing is designed to take the human dimension and the different dimension very seriously compared to the universal transformative revolutionary utopian movements. And one struggles with it. I'll give you obvious examples are, of course, women, which according to the Torah's vision, Zachar and Nekeva Bara'am are women at Tzelem Elokim. But in fact, in the period when the Torah is given, women were bought and sold. So the Torah does not repudiate that. What it does is limit it. The first limitation of the Torah, the first covenantal limitation, of course, is that only a father can sell. In other words, the commercial chattel of women is abolished, but the parent retains that right to sell, although again, in turn, the Torah says you can sell his daughter for an amma, which means that the purchaser promises to marry her. And when he does marry her, he has to give her the rights of a free woman, not of a purchased woman. So it's the first step. And again, in the covenantal method, that's the point. Slavery, gross violation of Tzelem Elokim, equality, dignity, and so on. The Torah's approach is start in the real world. The Brit approach is start in the real world. Slavery is universal. So what you do is you limit it. And again, the first start is not universal limitation, but Hebrew slave, Eved Ivri. Eved Ivri, you put a limit of 6 years. Eved Ivri, you put a limit of Shabbat. They're free on Shabbat, not to be worked like a slave. And the only limitation on non-Jewish slave is Shein Vayin. If you violate, if you beat, if you harm, if you injure, the slave is liberated. So these are very small first steps, but that's the covenantal method. And if one follows through the tradition, for example, in rabbinic times, the slave has to have equal food, equal hours. You can't give a slave servile labor. You have to give labor of dignity that the owner himself would be willing to do, and not just simply imposed because you're a slave and you can take advantage of your inferiority. In other words, step by step, you move toward that final goal. And the same holds true in terms of women. Chazal did not say, this is what the Torah gives them, and he went on to say, how about a ketubah, which would give her further rights, guaranteed, and even more important, if she gets divorced, she is guaranteed not to be thrown onto the garbage heap of poverty and of social pariah status, but guaranteed she will have enough money to be above the poverty line. So this combination of universal, revolutionary, transformative, and starting in the real world and doing it one step at a time is, I think, the unique secret of the tradition. Why I say that? Because we have lived through in the last 2 centuries an unparalleled, really in history, series of attempts at universal, revolutionary achievement of utopia. And what is very striking about all of them is that they end up turning against the human beings they're supposed to help. In other words, Nazism is basically National Socialism, an attempt to overcome economic inequality. It's an attempt to create not a war between classes but national unified community. It's an attempt to bring eugenics to improve the human race. But the combination of all these ideals authorizes or ends up being justified to mass murder, to suppress opposition, to get rid of the mental defectives, and of course the ultimate victim of the Jewish people. And one could go on and on. Marxism, communism, Stalinism, or the Chinese version of communism, Maoism, which again, in the name of making people equal, in the name of releasing women from the clearly major secondary status in China, liberates, but ends up destroying the family, trying to destroy the family, and killing millions of rich peasants because they're standing in the way of universal equality. I think the secret is because the vision is so glorious and so utopian that people get in the way. And so you turn against people, whereas the Brit says people are not in the way. You have to allow for their needs, respect the fact that they'd like to help their family first. So start with the family and then widen out. Respect the fact that they have limits and flaws and they're not going to drop it. That even the established and the oppressors work it out, negotiate, compromise. It may take longer, but in this way you will not turn into the enemy of the people who are on the other side of the coin. So I think that's part of the secret of the merger or the mix of universal, in particular of utopian vision and method of realism and of covenant. Now, having made my major point, now let me turn to the background. Let me now try to turn to the iterations. And I think, again, the iterations are such that the reason I try to call attention to it is that it may point us in what would be the most fruitful ways of responding to our situation. I start with the biblical iteration of Judaism. You have a vision of Tzelem Elokim of Gan Eden, but you also have a partnership in which God is very much the dominant partner. God controls history completely, almost. God gets people to do what God wants by reward and punishment in this life. That's how strongly controlling God is. And of course, again, God is the dominant partner taking initiative. For example, Yetziat Mitzrayim Exodus, which is the great liberation experience of the biblical period. But the Jews were not revolting, the Jews were not an initiative. They're really exhausted and to some extent already internalized slavery. And so Hashem sends Moshe to initiate. And it's God who brings the 10 plagues to break the authority and the arrogance of the Egyptian masters until they let them go. It's God who, when the Jews panic at the Red Sea, splits the sea and saves them. Hashem Elochem lechem v'atem tacharishun. The human partner is much weaker, much less, kind of a nochschlepper, as one would say, in this partnership. Now again, if you listen in the biblical period, if you listen to God, then it rains. And if you don't listen, it doesn't rain. And here again, it's very clear. The point is that people have to be trained, indoctrinated, maybe it's called the Skinner effect, they're conditioned to do the right thing. And the way you do it is by, again, God exercising reward and punishment. And if you listen to God, God will send a Redeemer to bring freedom. And if you betray God and you turn to Avodah Zarah, God will send a oppressor and a conqueror to destroy you. And again, if I had to capture the whole picture, in the book of Judges, Gideon is called to free the Jews, Israelites, from the oppression of Midian. And first he rounds up 30,000 fighters who are going to go with him to revolt, told to send them home. He has 10,000 left. He's told, send them home. In the end, he's told 300 people to go with warriors to go in and defeat Midian. And he said very directly, so you should not think that you are the one who saved the Jewish people. Hashem is the one who saves the Jewish people. And of course, it turns out he does win with the 300, and Hashem saves the Jewish people. And again, in every way, the dominant partner. How about revelation? Revelation comes from heaven, as at Sinai, or from Nevi'im. When you are, again, if you want to know what God wants you to do, Ko Amar Hashem. God sends a direct message with the exact words. In fact, part of that exact words is that you can't argue. In other words, if you disagree with the Navi, of course you're Chayav Misa, but it's not just that. If two Nevi'im disagree, what do you know? One of them is a liar. It's not that there's room for a contradiction. It's that it's a false prophet because God speaks authoritatively without forked tongue, and therefore the contradiction is in the false representation of what God is saying. Now, it's all, I would argue, it's all in a kind of a single or common hierarchy and a common complex culture. If you would turn on slide number 2, let me run through quickly what I consider the iteration itself. Okay? The time, it's the biblical area, prologue before Abraham, I don't know how you date Abraham, down to the Exodus, down to the first temple, the first Churban, and finally down to the second Churban. Location, Israel and Middle East. God's role, dominant, visible. Of course, you say you can't see God and live, but the fact is God is all but visible. You have many incidents where they come and see God. And of course, God is extraordinarily and constantly intervening. The human role is passive, the junior partner. And it's interesting, the leadership, therefore, as a result, the leadership is a genetic elite. What's it mean, genetic? Kohanim. What makes them the leader is their genes, which is another way of saying God has chosen them because biology, genes, is God's gift, and therefore God has chosen them. Or, as I said, in the case of the Navi, God selects the person and sends them to lead and to teach. Now, what's the counterpart religious lifestyle to a dominant God and a junior partner and a genetic elite? The answer is a temple which is sacramental. It has impacts, it affects, it causes changes in the individual and in the reality and in the sin by sacramental power. It's not the individual's power, it's the power of the Mikdash and of the Kohen. One brings sacrifices, it's a family ritual, passive, they're not very active, they bring the animal but they watch while the Kohen does most of the work. The worshippers are not educated, it's very much agriculture, nature oriented, and of course sacred space and sacred time are very much set aside. God is so powerful and so dynamic, God is so powerful and so dynamic that you can't just go anywhere because it's dangerous, and in fact, people get too close to God, get electrocuted on the spot. So you go to places where God is available, but they're very special places, and typically they're shielded, as it were. It's almost like radiation. So in the Beit HaMikdash, you're shielded by the walls of the Beit HaMikdash, you're shielded by the protection. And the Kohen stands between you and the inner sanctum, which is shielded from the people. And so again, it becomes, sacred spaces are not many, but where they are, they're very special and visible and set aside. It's a kind of a form of Prussian. Now again, there's a great redemptive event of this period, of course, it's Yetziat Mitzrayim, and it's referred to when one goes back to it. One reenacts it annually. There's also a counter event that challenges the message of liberation and perfection, which of course is the Churban, particularly the first Beit HaMikdash. And the institutions, again, reflect this. The institutions are temple, sacrifice, temple, not home, sacrifice, prophet, and of course the monarchy. And the challenge, nevertheless, being can you live covenantal values in this society or versus power politics? Can those who rule do a society of mishpat, or will they in fact turn out to be venal and corrupt and self-seeking? So that is the biblical, I would argue that's all one whole. which brings me to the rabbinic tradition. The second Churban particularly is a turning point, although again, the rabbinic tradition, I believe, starts before the Churban, because it is beginning, to claim it at least, the beginning is that God self-limits again. Just as God self-limited to join the covenant, so God is self-limited, as it were, renews the covenant, but the difference in renewing this covenant is that it's God's will that the other partner, the human partner, step up, take up more authority, more responsibility, and more authority in the system. So it's not a form of distancing. This is not a hester punim. This is a form of self-limitation in order to enable and to encourage the human partner to do more. The classic passage in Yuma, Samach Terem Beis, the Gemara explains the words Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor VaHanora, which open the Shmon Esrei, and which are quotes from Moshe in Devarim. But in Moshe in Devarim means Gibor VaHanora, the almighty God who smashes the enemies, the awesome God who cannot be resisted. Chazal then say that no longer exists. If it was, why did the Romans defeat the rebels who were in fact revolted for God, not against God? They were trying to get rid of the Roman statues. They were trying to be faithful to tradition. Why did God not split the Mediterranean Sea and drown the Romans? The answer is, Ezo Gibor HaKovesh, God has shifted, and God's Gevurah is now expressed not in smashing the enemy or controlling history, but in self-limiting, allowing freedom of action to the Romans and freedom of action to the Jews. And if you look again at the Chataim, again, the very famous Gemara, the Chataim of the first temple that led to destruction were Shvichat Damim, which is not just a sin against humans, but against God, killed the Tzelem Elokim, Avodah Zarah, and Gila Arayot, again, which the tradition treats as the three cardinal sins that are revolts against God, not just against humans. But the second by it, again, the famous Gemara, it's Sinat Chinam. They had lots of mitzvahs of Sinat Chinam, but if you translate Sinat Chinam in the Gemara's portrait of the Churban in Gittin, what is it? It's that Kamsa Bar Kamsa, that one Jew humiliates and degrades another, and no one protects him or helps him. In fact, the rabbis who are present are silent and stand by while this abuse takes place. Then when he gets angry and goes to the Romans to make trouble, then you get this famous case of, he tells the emperor they've revolted against you, and the proof is send them a korban, and if they won't deliver it, it's because they're revolting. And of course it turns out that the korban has a punctured ear, which is by the Romans kosher, but by the Jews not. And again, Rabbi Zechariah of Kilis refuses to allow them to bring the korban. Again, it's a classic example of how legalism and human irresponsibility, don't understand the Torah, don't understand the value of life. So he says, either you can't bring this korban because it's a mum, or he insists that if you let it go through because the Romans may attack and may destroy, that would be a form, again, of failing or to uphold the tradition and giving in to brute force. But again, so as Rabbi Yochanan says, his legalism, his lack of responsibility, his lack of authority, that's what caused the destruction of the temple. In other words, the sins, and the sins are the recklessness of the zealots who revolt against the world's greatest power in a very unwise time. Instead of trying to negotiate a settlement, as Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai eventually does, it's the zealots who are so carried away by their own recklessness that they burn the food supplies of Jerusalem in order to force the other Jews to fight. So the transformation is simply the human responsibility, the human behavior has much more of an effect than the outcome. Now all of that becomes again part of a whole classic revelation, for example. So you will no longer have voices from heaven or nevuah, so what's left? If you don't have voices nevuah, the answer is the answer is you ask a rabbi. That is to say, human beings use their intelligence to assess. Partly they study the past record of God's revelation, and partly they use their judgment to apply to the present moment. And it turns out that when humans apply their judgment, you can have machlokas, in fact, becomes the key weapon of getting deeper insight and greater truth. Because the truth is that when people in good faith use their mind at their best, they can come up with two contradictory interpretations of the same tradition and of the same pasuk. Unlike the Nevi'im, where one of them had to be a liar. So again, the main move the rabbis say is self-limitation to call the human beings further is hiddenness. God hides. God is not visible as in the first phase, but here's the paradox again. God becomes hidden to come closer. And I think this is one of the central, I was struggling both misunderstanding of Chazal, but I think misunderstanding what I'm trying to argue also. This is not a hester punim. God comes closer. God presents now as Shekhinah. You don't have Shekhinah in Tanakh, but you have Shekhinah here. Who Shekhinah is the hidden, kind, maternal, much lower voltage God who can get close to you without electrocuting you, who can get close to you without overwhelming and intimidating. And Shekhinah is everywhere. So again, instead of God being in certain very limited settings, God becomes available everywhere. When you sit at a table, you're eating, make a bracha. This is like a korban because God is present. When you sit at a table and say divrei Torah, God is present. When a husband and wife, ish vishto, when they make love in a bedroom, zachu, if they do it the right way, respect the tzedem elokim of the other, shechina beinehem, and so on. So you have a tremendous expansion of halakha, not because it's a tremendous halakha, because in fact, what's halakha? It's covenantally reshaping life behaviors on the grounds that I'm living inside a covenant. I want to commit myself not only as a society to work for life, but as an individual to work for life, and that every action of mine will be studied to maximize life. So let me just finish this understanding of the rabbinic tradition and of the idea of, well, actually, take it back. Can you show the slide number 3, the rabbinic tradition? You see the same set of, complex. You have that. Again, rabbinic era, as I say, from 1st century straight through till the 19th and 20th century in Eastern Europe. Now located in diaspora, Middle East, Asia, Europe, Israel with a very minor presence. God's role, even more hidden, much more hidden than before, operates in the natural with human partner. You no longer have visible miracles. You have hidden miracles, but you don't have visible miracles anymore. And again, there are lots of exceptions in the Gemara, but these are individual cases. The collective vision of God's role is the age of visible miracles is over. And again, in this human role, it's much more equal partner, much more participatory. And the leadership, therefore, is not genetically determined by God. It's a psychic elite based on achievement, learning, mastery of the tradition, and mastery of the ability to apply the tradition. So the counterpart religious leadership is not priest and prophet, it's rabbis. In the later period, it's rebbes, it's scholars, and the beginning at the very end of the emergence of lay people. And what's the counterpart religious lifestyle? Again, synagogue and prayer, as against the passive, against the temple which was in one limited place, or the Mishkan. The synagogue is all over the world possible. It's prayer in which the participants speak up rather than sit quietly and watch. It's a home, it's holiness and learning and law, much more participatory on the part of the people. We don't have that much evidence, but the indication is that most Jews in the biblical period were illiterate, whereas Chazal make it central that they study and understand, so that they understand what they're doing and they apply it in the best they can. Finally, my point is that the redemptive event, just as the Exodus is the visible God intervening, Purim is the Pesach, as it were, of the rabbinic period. And Chazal make it very clear in the classic passage in Shabbat Kimu v'kiblu Yehudim, kimu masha kiblu kfar. This is a reenactment and a reacceptance of the covenant. If you think about it, it's a major shift, because in the biblical period, if you kept the covenant, you were guaranteed results. Here, that guarantee is taken away. So it takes a certain courage and a certain commitment on the part of the Jewish people, because they become more mature. And even reward and punishment, Chazal do their best to shift people away from reward and punishment in this life. Schar mitzvah b'hai alma leka. There's no direct, obvious schar mitzvah in this world, say Chazal. Where do you get the reward? In Olam Haba, fine. But first of all, Olam Haba is a long way away. If you will study the economics of it, you know, if you get cash now, as against 20 years from now, it's discounted by the time. Well, in the sense, I'm saying that what they're trying to do is de-emphasize or reduce the value and the salience of reward in terms of bringing people to do it more lishma, right? Al tiyu avodim hameshamshin etzarav al manat l'kabel pras. You should become like an Eved who does it shelo al manat l'kabel pras. Okay, let me finish now with my argument of the third iteration as emerging. Again, my argument is it starts in modernity. Why? Because I'm arguing God's self-limits to call humans to take full responsibility. The message of modernity, again, I'm arguing all these symptoms don't just affect Jews. All humans pick up this signal. The message of modernity can be said in one sentence. Humans take power to redeem or perfect the world. In a sense, that is the message, and of course, that is exactly what the power has been. In fact, of some amazing achievements by taking power, overcoming enemies of life, right? Poverty. In the last century, 2.5 billion people have been taken out of poverty. Hunger. There's now enough food produced that no one should be hungry. If there's a hunger, it's because of maladministration and mistreatment of people by government and society, lack of liberation. Oppression, major movements for women's equality, for race equality, for gay liberation, against anti-Semitism. One could go on and on, but in other words, that is the mark of a major accomplishments in this area. Overcoming war, well, less successful, but they tried. League of Nations, United Nations, all kinds of international laws trying to keep peace and regulate war. And sickness, of course, it's been a period of amazing medical achievements, curing diseases that were once impossible, including genetic diseases, and in life extension in a major sort of way. The tragedy of this third iteration is, of course, that the religious leadership hardly recognized what was happening. To a certain extent, I would say, in all religions, not just ours, the leadership mostly saw this human activity as somehow at God's expense, and therefore rejected it, and it ended up creating an environment where the people who were trying to do these work saw themselves as secular, or concluded that religion is the enemy, religion is the power of the status quo, and the price we pay for that. In other words, you achieve many of the goals and dreams of the Brit, but you lose the covenantal dimension. And therefore, and the way it shows up, of course, is in abuse, in the environmental crisis, where you take God's creation and you abuse it, you pollute it, species destruction. One could go on and on, but in effect, this is the symptom of the breakdown of the covenantal sense, that humans feel that they're agents, that they feel they're accountable, that they're not the masters of the universe, but are in partnership. So that is lost. Now, what's my proof that in fact this is so, that we're living in an age where God is totally hidden and humans are totally responsible? Or, as I argue, there are more miracles in our time than ever before, but they're done exclusively through human agents and through natural laws. As, for example, again, medicine, where you discover, medicine discovers the power in this particular chemical or this particular radiation that can kill a disease. So it's a miracle, or for that matter, the miracle of an iPhone, right? I speak here and or for that matter, I'm speaking in the Zoom and people hundreds of miles away are seeing and hearing it. These are miracles, but they take place through human agents and through natural laws application. Now, what's my proof? Well, I suggest the obvious. I'll start with a settler proof and then the obvious one. The settler proof is, of course, medical today. You do much more statistical studies of cure rates and so on. And frankly, there is no evidence that a Rebbe's bracha will bring you a miraculous in a more systematic fashion than medicine. The more serious proof I'm arguing, of course, is the Shoah. Again, without denying the extent to which the Shoah disturbed and doesn't have any explanation or any answer, the bottom line remains, if you look at the Shoah, what do you see? You see no visible divine intervention. The claim that God is doing miracles behind the scenes, well, if anything, the death rates among religious Jews, among Orthodox Jews, was much higher than the rest of the population, mostly because most of them were in Eastern Europe where 95% were killed, and partly because Orthodox or Haredi Jews had less connections to Gentiles and therefore less chance to be saved. But if you look again, there's an enormous shift, a variation in the survival rates during the Shoah. Enormous shift. And that is, on the one extreme, Lithuania, 95% die. In Poland, 90% die. In Russia, 90% die. In Denmark, 95+% are saved. In Bulgaria, the entire Bulgarian Jewish community was saved by the Bulgarians. What's the difference? The Nazis did all their best to wipe out, and they used their freedom, which God has given humans, to wipe out the Jewish people, and they did a very good job using modern technology and modern techniques. They showed you can take modern culture and turn it into a force for death, so it can a force for life.
My parents saved in Bulgaria.
I want to come back to Bulgaria for a minute. Bulgaria was an Axis ally. They were rewarded by the Germans with two Greek provinces, Thrace and Macedonia. When the Nazis came for the Bulgarian Jews, the Bulgarians as a community decided they're Bulgarians, they're not separate Jews, they're Bulgarians, we will not let you take them. And they saved them. Having said that, Thrace and Macedonia were Greek Jews, not Bulgarians. So they let the Nazis take the Jews of Thrace and Macedonia and send them to Auschwitz, and less than 100 survived. So it seems to me that the message of the Shoah is very clear, that it's the human behavior. That's exactly what I'm claiming is the divine self-limitation, which came many years before the Shoah. The divine self-limitation that God will be with us. So I have, when I started, I was asking, where was God in the Shoah? I came to the obvious understanding that's not correct question. God was in the ghetto and the concentration camp, in the gas chambers choking, and everybody else is. Suffering, pain, like only an infinite consciousness can feel. So the question is not that. The question is, why did not God stop the Shoah? And there my answer is, we were told 100 years before, it's your responsibility, it's the human activity. And had the Allies acted, had the neighbors acted as the Danes did, it would have been a whole different outcome. Now, the other major message of the Shoah, of course, is that humans have to take power in order to protect life and to assure it. And that exactly is what the Jewish people understood. So Zionism, which was a minority and a small minority before the war, became the overwhelming reality of the Jewish people and their commitment. Because the Jewish people understand they have to take power, and the only way you can take power is creating the state of Israel. And because they took power, they renewed the covenant, and with amazing, the Jewish people using that power created an exodus of our time, the third iteration, an exodus greater than the biblical. I've often thought of that. The Torah says in Bo that 600,000 adult Jews left Egypt. There were 600,000 Jews in the Yishuv in the War of Independence. But After that came 250,000 survivors. 800,000 Jews came from Arab lands where they were expelled. 150,000 Ethiopians were rescued from Ethiopia. Several hundred thousand Russian Jews came out, few at a time, for 20 years, and then in 1990s, 1.5 million came. So this exodus far outnumbers the scope of the exodus of the biblical period. As in fact, Yeshayahu long ago predicted that the final exodus would be greater than the original one. But one could go on and on in terms of the comparisons. Quality of life. Compare the difference between a slave and a free citizen in a homeland, not to be made light of. Compare that to being in Auschwitz, valueless, overworked, killed, tortured, starved, to living in Jerusalem as a free person and as a free nation. So my argument is that this is in fact exactly what one has predicted, and in fact again, Yirmiyahu said it long before me. Yamim Ba'im, the time will come when they will say, Chai Hashem Asher Helad B'nai Yisrael Me'eretz Mitzrayim. No, they won't say that. They will say, Kiyim Chai Hashem Asher Helad B'nai Yisrael Me'eretz Safon U'mikol Haratzot Asher Yidicham Sham. So the truth is, looking back, it was the secular Jews and the Zionists. Thank God there were some Orthodox Jews with them, but they were the minority who were doing God's work. This is Rav Kook's insight, except in retrospect, he was mistaken. It's not a holy revolt. They were doing exactly what God asked them to do. The reason they didn't do the, I'm slightly exaggerating, they didn't do the Shabbat and the Kashrut, if they could help themselves, they had to do it because they had to get help of the other Jews. They did it because they got the message that if you believe in Shabbat and if you're committed to Kashrut, you're also against Zionism and against... Anyway, be that as it may, my point is that this is the response of the historical response. And again, so how do I conclude? My conclusion is that this third iteration, you want to show that slide? You show that slide, that's, that's slide number 4. You'll see the same set of comparison where it's an entire iteration and not just a specific. In other words, take a look at God's role. The most hidden operates completely in the natural process. Humans have full responsibility. The managing partner, a full democratic leadership. In other words, unlike the first iteration where God chooses, or the second where you can achieve it by learning, but only for males. In the third iteration, everybody can make it, and in fact, it turns out quite a few women leaders and still growing. The counterpart religious leadership, therefore, I argue, is lay leadership. I think the future of the discovering holiness will be in the professions, in the workplace, and there the doctor or the lawyer or the social worker will be the one who discovers the presence of Hashem, the hidden presence, by treating the fellow human beings as Etzel Elokim. So in the counterpart religious style, we have lay institutions, the community center, the army, the various civic activity and civic activity institutions. So again, lay institutions and secular holiness and holy secularity. The exodus of our time is Israel. The Churban of our time is the Holocaust. And the institutions are democracy, Knesset, army, higher education, day schools, you can go to the whole list, media, Holocaust memorial centers, NGOs. So it's a period of more action and less prayer. And the challenge is no different than it has been in the past. It's to reconcile power and justice and freedom. So the principle that has guided the religion all the way through, I'd argue, which is to choose life. Rambam explains choose life means that every mitzvah and every good deed represents a choice of life. Rambam's famous, it's not Rambam, Rambam quotes in the guide, quotes Moshe Rabbeinu. Ray, what is the Torah? Nasati lefanecha hayom et hachayim ve'et hatov, et hamavet, ve'et hara. So Rambam is very simple. Chayim and Tov are synonymous, they go together. and Mavet and Ra go together. Meaning, every mitzvah and every good deed involves some choice of life as against choosing death, or maybe a situation where you can maximize life as against and minimize death. Every evil act, every lo saseh, is a choice of death in some form or fashion. You could give hundreds of examples. I'd be happy to explore them with you. How about in eating, where the basic truth behind kashrut is the notion that you shouldn't be eating animals. And according to the Torah and according to the Nevi'im, in the Gan Eden, past and future, there will be only vegetarians, because your eating, which is the source of your life, should not be the source of death for somebody else. And one could go on and on with that ritual. For example, the requirement that if you want to kill a bird or an animal, you have to use a special form of shechita, which is presumably instant death and more painless. In short, the ritual attempts to say, here's how you can turn eating into a maximum of life and a minimum of death. And one could go on and applying it if one was functioning in the third era by saying you don't eat species that are overfished. One could go on and on. And one could say speech the same way. What does it mean? Speech can be a speech of quality of life, of affirming life, upholding life, or speech can be degrading, discriminating, hurting life. So again, the principle, I would argue again, and this is what the halakha is meant to be, is how in the next life behavior, eating, speaking, traveling, how do you maximize life when you travel? Well, the answer is mass transport has less carbon footprint than private cars. Electric cars have less carbon footprint than fossil cars. In short, I would argue in the third stage, God is totally present everywhere, but so hidden that you have to uncover it. And that's what lay people are supposed to be doing. And in the third stage, halakha is in every area, in every place. It has to be shaped, it has to be articulate, it has to be developed. The third era is misunderstood. In the introduction we were said that too. We gave the example of, Tanya White gave the example of here we decided never again and created the state of Israel, and look what happened October 7th. My answer is, on the contrary, in the third era, humans are fully responsible. Their practice, their tactics, their judgment affects the outcomes. There's no guarantee in the third era that God will never suffer. The proof that of never again is that on October 7th, in the evening and the next day, IDF went in and in fact stopped or killed the terrorists who had inflicted this terrible crime. The difference is not that there'll never be a setback or a massacre or a pogrom. The difference is that the Jewish people has power to fight back. That having been said, we have the Haredi religious version that tells us we can pray and learn, and that will be enough to serve in the army. I would say that actually fails to understand its first iteration, but it totally misunderstands the lesson of the third iteration, which is that your behavior and your responsibility will make the difference in the outcome. And I would argue the same thing in terms of Messianic religious Zionism. The notion that we can overextend ourselves, we can take over completely Eretz Yisrael HaShlema, that we can impose our will on not only the Palestinians, but on anybody, because God will cover us in the end, is again a fallacy and a failure, or reflects an earlier understanding. We're living in the age where the human behavior, responsible or reckless, knowing the limits of power, knowing when you need allies and how you need them and how you use them, will make a difference in the outcome. So it's an unfinished voyage of third era. And I think one of the most important things we could do would be to understand the religious transformation and free up the religion which is now in the hands of people who, as I say, are fixated either on the first iteration, where as long as they're doing what they think God says, it will be done by God, or other people have no right to say what they or believe or act what they want to do, or people who in the name of God, as I said, try to violate realistic human, political, military judgment, could bring catastrophe. But it also means that if we have the will and the understanding, that we can resume what Israel stands for in the first place. It means not only to fight until we defeat our enemies, and that will take human sacrifice, will not be done for us, but we also have the capacity to resume the construction of a society that is based on tzedek, that is based on recognizing Tzalmo Elokim. That's a model for the whole world could learn for. How you build an economy when you don't have resources, how you take people from pre-modern Ethiopia and help them become fully participatory without losing their identity in the background. Sure, there are 100 ways in which Israel is still available and can make the choice to be an Or LaGoyim, and that depends on choosing life realistically. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much, Rabbi Professor. It's Greenberg. I think, in addition to being extremely insightful and illuminating, it was also very moving to listen to you. I was personally moved by the theological language, because this is something we didn't have here. For the annual lecture, we had religious feminism, we had politics, we had all kinds of approaches to the subject of, what would Judaism mean to the modern age. But that was the first real theological lecture, actually, within this framework. And I thank you very much for, just giving us the opportunity to see the world also from this point of view. There are a few minutes left for questions, and I think I will take questions here from the room for technical reasons. If there are any remarks, things you want to ask. Professor Meir, just take the microphone.
So thank you so much for this for this great and in which you gave your vision on history and on Jewish history. And as Ya'akov says, it's really a pleasure to hear you and to hear this entire vision expressed by you. Now, my question is on the level of theology. If you see what Hans Jonas is doing, Hans Jonas with his idea of the Tzimtzum, the self-retreat of God, and if you see what Daniel Birnbaum is doing in his unified theodicy, these are two different models. You have Hans Jonas with the self-retreat, which is complete and giving the responsibility, the entire responsibility to the human being. Daniel Birnbaum is a different thing because you have a kind of progressive retreat, giving gradually more and more responsibility to the human being. I guess you're coming more close to the second model, but I'm not entirely sure. Giving the fact also that my teacher Levinas says that there is a bankruptcy of theodicy after the Shoah. So I was wondering where you feel more at home, in Hans Jonas or Daniel Birnbaum, perhaps also a little bit Levinas?
I think I'm reflecting my religious or Jewish tradition in treating God as a kind of dynamic personality, interacting, more than Jonas, who I think to some extent is using more, I don't know, abstract or more objective language, maybe more naturalistic language, although I remain. So part of the answer is I am a little vague myself, and in fact, to some extent, I'm trying not to be too precise because, in effect, all of the above may be possible, and I'm sort of trying to allow for that as well. In my first phase, and by the way, the comment about the bankruptcy of theology. In my first phase, particularly responding to the fact that they were formally religious people on the Nazi side too. So my reaction sort of was, so we have to stop talking about God. And maybe if for 200 years we don't mention God's name, maybe the evil people will forget it, so we can then reclaim it. And so to some extent, my answer is there's a set of possibilities here, and I'm not sure that I can give a theological psak, this is the right one. I'm trying to some extent to straddle all these possibilities. One is, as I said, not speak about God. One is to speak about God in this, but then I feel I'm imitating Chazal, speaking about God in this progressive, and it's not a retreat. Again, that's the one thing I would like to add. It's not a retreat. It's something you learn as a parent too. When you love somebody, it becomes very important to steadily restrain, take less, self-limit, not because you're retreating or you're distancing, but because this is what makes possible the flowering, the development of the other child. So I really do feel, again, against this argument is the fact that I see no scientific evidence that the laws of nature have changed, or that God has, so to speak, dynamically changed interaction with humans. But I'd like to, at least as a narrative, I think it's a legitimate description of what's happening. And as a narrative, that's why I love Chazal. I mean, Kel Rachel Mechanun Erech Apayim Rachel V'nakeh. To me, that's my model. In other words, that they felt they had a right to say, yeah, in the first iteration is Nake Lo Yanake, but we're telling you it's more accurate now, or at least in this present moment, it's V'nake, not V'nake Lo Yanake. And I'd like to think in the same situation, the third, or as I mentioned it before the conversation. In that sense, I walked back voluntary covenant. When I wrote voluntary covenant, I was under the first of all, the emotional control of the history. And the history was, God did the covenant and did take responsibility and took care of me. So I was sort of angry and maybe disillusioned, and so under the spell of that view, combined with the emotional and shock of what happened, say, well, God didn't live up to the covenant, and therefore what I'm doing now is voluntary. What I've come to see since then, and this is my argument in the book, that it was always intended that way. When you're a loving parent, you don't tell the child everything, nor do you put all the obligations on them when they're 5. You give them a different set of obligations when they're 15 and a different set of obligations when they're 25. And I feel that's what happened here in the Brit. If you think of God as a loving parent and not just as a natural force with no subjective elements, again, I appreciate the attempt to establish objective behaviors and objective standards, but I think there's a profoundly human dimension in recognizing the subjective. So I now walked it back. I don't think it was God's failure that made it voluntary. It was God's will that it become voluntarily. It just still taking time for humans to realize that, to grow up and to take responsibility.
I have 2 comments from the chat and one from myself. First of all, Miriam Feldman K, please thank him for the wonderful talk from the viewers. So that's the first one. There is also from Deborah Davids, and thank you very much for the inspiring lecture. Tzvi Shimon suggests that all the ideas of the 3 great areas we can find in the first one. That we can find the movement from a God-centered historical leadership of Kriyat Yam Suf to human responsibility in Joshua. So maybe it's kind of from Nes to Teva, as they call it here. And I would want to add, since I'm familiar with your theology, with your talk and your ideas, and I'll try to listen to you from the perspective of the October 7th. And I would ask you, if you agree to details, to share a few words about the meaning of choosing life, ובחרת בחיים, today, after the October 7th, when we are in the war, in the middle of war, because of the war we killed a lot of people. We try to keep our citizens from our side. Not every time we succeed. To choose life today is very, very difficult, imperative. Can you say a few words about it?
I'll start with your first point, though, from the audience. And what was that first point?
This one is wonderful.
Oh yes, it starts in Tanakh. But to me that's part of, again, it's not, you're not starting from scratch. To me that's part of the continuity. When there's transformation, but it's continuity. Yes, you already see in Tanakh the movement from the dominant, visible, controlling God to God less and less. There's a book by Richard Friedman calling the disappearance of God, in which he tries to show that the later sections of Tanakh, you don't have visible miracles anymore, you don't have yes. Now in fact, if you could take a minute to show, my argument is that all three iterations, they grow out of each other, so they're not totally imposed. In slide 5, the divine presence, you will see, you have that, in the divine presence in 5, it starts in a smaller set-aside, right? Consecrated by God, highly concentrated, a very limited number of places. But in the second phase, there are more special locations, now consecrated not just by God, but by human divine in partnership, and the Shekhinah and Elohim. And then in the third stage, located everywhere. My point is, if you project it, one is an extension, and it doesn't start completely from scratch. Each one, in a sense, has the kernel from which the second stage grows, and the third stage. And the same holds true with halakha. In the first stage, it is a very limited number of areas where it's focused. And then, under rabbinic tradition, tremendous expansion, and my argument is, today, even greater expansion. Now again, what do you mean greater expansion? So part my answer is, Chazal helped us by setting up brachot. So there are two possibilities, and I'm open to either one. One is that we should be writing all kinds of new brachot. If I can quote my wife, it's one of my favorite lines from her. She said, if rabbis were women and not men, and they gave birth, would we have a great bracha for giving birth? In other words, so my answer is, it's not too late. Besides, they're now women rabbis, so maybe. So one is, we have the choice of writing brachot, and they should be doing much more than that, of that. And of course, again, the problem is that we don't have a serious halachic religious leadership. The Yom HaTzmaut and Yom HaShoah, which in my mind are just as sacred and just as powerful and just as meaningful as Pesach and the Churban and Tisha B'Av, but they were created by the Knesset because the rabbis didn't understand that. They tried to fob it off on Asar B'Teves because that was the most neglected of the Churban of the Bayit. So I mean, again, so not serious people. So one possibility is we do a lot more brachot than we're doing right now. Or second choice, we don't have brachot, you have meditation. You have kavanah, you have some awareness. And again, my point is, a doctor, a surgeon, treating the patient religiously, what does that mean? Well, number one is, instead of overwhelming with treatment, you try to go with the natural immunity systems. You try to work with the patient as a partner, not just as an object. It's one religion, because it's Salam Elokim, it should be treated as equal. And then the second stage of it is to see in the need and in the Hashem is with the et dakar shval ruach. When the patient is broken, when the patient is suffering, when the patient is depressed, when the patient can help themselves, that's the moment when you can show kindness, when you can show awareness, you can show helpfulness. That really is the true recognition and restoration of Tzelem Elokim. So here again, my answer is, that's the other potential way in which holiness, now again, I as an outsider can't do it. That's why we have to train the rabbis, the doctors to be the rabbis of their period, or to train the lawyers, or to train the social workers, so they will be able to, in the spot and in the moment, which I don't understand because I'm not in the thick of it, they can apply and bring out the awareness of divine presence. And in general, it means reconceiving halakha not as a legal system, but as a way of shaping and reshaping every human activity, every interactive activity. When I speak, when I relate, when I cure, when I work on this person, at that very moment, I am aware of connecting to not only the Tzelem Elokim of this person, but the Elokim of which this person is the Tzelem. And it's just like Chazal said, when you make love properly, God is present. If you treat properly, if you guide and heal properly, if you social work and understand and help reform and emotionally uplift the person, there's the divine presence. So again, it's a completely wide open field that is waiting for a serious uncovering of the divine presence. And of course, again, so it means, Tamar Ross has written out, means a continuous revelation, but revelation, again, not coming from heaven, but a revelation that unfolds before our eyes and which we are able to see. Yeah.
We've had an argument on paper.
Sorry, I'll come back to you.
We've had an argument on paper, which we haven't spoken about directly, and I don't know whether this is the forum for it, but I view your whole take on Jewish history as a kind of optional narrative, which is very inspiring, but not to be taken as a factual account, because it involves some debatable interpretation. Mm-hmm. The first question is if we liken God's relationship to us like that of a parent who's training a child to independence. When he walks across the street alone, at some point, no matter how the parent is determined to give this child independence, if he sees a car coming towards him and he's going to obviously be killed, he will move in and escape, let him escape from that horrible eventuality. And it's hard not to think about the Shoah in these terms. Could God have restrained himself so much just for the sake of our independence? And the second is a question of how we relate to the past and the biblical accounts of God's intervention the first time, or in the first period, and even in the second. Do we really understand the biblical account of what happened as an objective account? Perhaps had we been there with our scientific knowledge of today, or even our understanding of the way these events were related in the Torah, are debatable, and we might have viewed either a scientific explanation of the man and of the splitting of the seas, or we might, in a more critical, historical, and factual perspective, say this was a mythic account, but not really what took place. So the whole picture, while beautiful, and is not totally compelling on a factual level, but perhaps it's a perspective that we voluntarily adopt in order to maintain some sort of feeling of connection with God, but this isn't the whole story from a factual point of view.
Well, of course, you're my model and my teacher in this last comment. So my answer is, you're correctly in saying that what I'm describing I am assuming that the Bible is a narrative, not a objective account. But I'm saying, as I said, I learned that from you, among other people, you know, that human beings live by narratives, and I believe it's an act of God's love to offer us something that can turn into this kind of a narrative, and that's a narrative that that's a narrative which yes, and again, you're quite right saying that my narrative is selective, and there are major pieces of the tradition that I'm not ignoring, I'm just not giving them the weight. I'm stringing, for example, again, so I think that's all true, but I don't think you've changed. You're just pointing out correctly, this is one narrative and there are lots of other potential narratives. And secondly, that I'm assuming much of the past record is a narrative, and the answer is yes. And about the Shoah and freedom, so I appreciate your comment for one reason, because if you take what I said about the Shoah literally, then you have an answer. You have an explanation of the Shoah, and to me that is outrageous. In other words, so I'm saying it seems to me it has to remain absurd. It has to remain a brokenness. That's so again. We're all broken. Our model of perfection is also broken. But some of the time, whether it's 2% or 8% or 98%, it works, and that's what I think that's the point. In other words, as long as you understand, and I accept it 100%, that it's not a full explanation satisfactory. Of course, in the end, I mean, there was a period and I was in total rage, right? In other words, the child is crossing the street, the car is coming, do me a favor, go back to your primitive, first iteration and save it. What are you talking about? So there's no answer for that. Well, we're discussing after the fact how you understand it. And I do feel after the fact, and I do feel after the fact that the knowledge that we are responsible, the knowledge that we have to take power, that was already understood by people. Unfortunately, it was 4% of the Jewish people who became chalutzim, and 90% didn't go that way. So again, so it's a very different, so I'm not saying that we have an answer, but if we had understood it this way, and I say the same thing today, if we understood it properly, millions of Jews could have gone in Aliyah, could have built Israel 100 years earlier, and a lot more people would have been saved. So that's my answer to your second question. It's not an explanation of the Shoah. It is in part an explanation of what happened and why it happened and how it could have happened differently. And that, I think, is life-saving. Let me finish up because I suspect I've overrun my time. Sorry. I apologize for the length in general. I want to come back to Hannah's question because I take it very seriously. So when I say choose life, let me just say in general, to me that's the central mitzvah of the Torah. It's of course bechalt בחיים, but it's the central mitzvah, and I think just like I think Rambam was correct in saying Chaim and Tov is identical. My argument is that that's Moshe's summary of bechalt בחיים. That is the central thing. Now again, how you apply bechalt בחיים, each case comes with differently. To have children is a choice of bechalt בחיים. To fall in love and to live together in marriage for a lifetime, or even not for a lifetime, that's a bechalt בחיים. The child, when the child grows up, and that's one of the parent responsibilities, is to give them their trust and the satisfaction of respect, so they'll be capable of friendship beyond themselves. They'll be capable of loving to the point of changing their lives or committing their lives. That's one of the most important contributions parents can make, and if they handle it wrong, it's the opposite, and the child learns not to trust, not to go beyond their own skin, and so on. So, bechalt בחיים, number one, is the central. Now, my secondary comment was bechalt בחיים, that every other mitzvah should be judged by the same criteria, which means in some cases that it no longer fits that, and therefore you have to improve it. You're not rejecting it, you're not reforming. You are, but it's not a negative term of reform. In other words, when women get to learn, or get to be rabbis, or get to be leaders of tefillah, My point is, this is an improvement and an enrichment and of life, including the quality of life of women, and as a result, and since many of the Chazanit that I've heard have beautiful voices, so it's an improvement of the quality of my davening also. So that's another whole set. So Bechart B'chaim is a guide not just to the specifics, but it's what direction do you change? Now again, looking back, now that we know that gay people are genetically and hormonally, and not just perversely, attracted to a same sex, so it seems to me that's a moral and religious responsibility. Bechart B'chaim means if that is in fact Chaim, that it should be recognized, it should be encouraged, it should be respected, and asked to live to the same criteria that I ask heterosexual, mainly it should be based on relationship, it should be based on love and faithfulness, it should be based on monogamy, it should try to raise a family. That's what it seems to me, that's part of Bechart B'chaim. Now we'll come back to October 7th. I'm very shocked too. We're all shocked. Number one, first of all, we're much more vulnerable than we thought. Number one, I really thought anti-Semitism is considerably down, and I was wrong. It is down compared to the past, but it's certainly much stronger than I thought. So again, but there's no guarantees here. We're on a voyage of freedom, and God has accepted our freedom, and we've accepted our freedom. So my answer is, certainly shocking, upsetting things have come on October 7th. However, the main point is, number one, and that to me is the future of the Jewish people in Israel. We have a friend who told us, she's leaving. I was even more disturbed to see an article recently in this last week that according to JPPI, 25% of the Jewish Israelis are thinking of emigration. But my answer is, Bechart B'chaim, to the extent that people choose, they want to live as Jews, they want to continue to live as Jews, that they want to live in the Jewish homeland, number one is that, so then this is what encourages me. The parents I talk to, including myself, my grandchildren, my children, are they prepared to do risking their children's life? There's the real shock of October 7th, there's the realization that probably in every generation we're going to have a war, and there are going to be more Israeli soldiers dying in those wars than we imagine. And my daughter is here. When her first child was born in the 1990s, my wife and I had this discussion. We had the same reaction. Her first child was born. We said, "Oh my God, when it'll grow up, 18 years from now, I'll have to go to the war and have to take this terrible risk," right? Then we said, no, at the Oslo, there's going to be peace. By the time he grows up, they won't have an army, well, that was wrong. What I see now from the parents and from the young generation is they understand that, they understand the price, and it's going to be more soldiers and more dead. They're prepared to pay it. I now look back, see, that's what the Arcade is about. I'm really convinced of that. I mean, in the end, he doesn't sacrifice, and so what was the point of putting him through the whole exercise? I think somehow it was a message to us, the future generations, that part of being a Jew is you're going to have to tie your child, and there's no guarantee they may die. And that's a price. As long as people are willing to pay that price, that's what Bechart B'chaim means. Now, secondly, Bechart B'chaim, in attacking the Gazans and so on, I do think that's a major responsibility to try to keep civilian casualties down. Now, I've written and I'll defend it. I think IDF has made a serious attempt to do so, very serious attempt. The main reason for the major expansion of civilian casualties is because, for two reasons. The main reason is because Hamas has placed all its soldiers and all its activity in the civilian territory, in the mosques, in the schools, in the homes, and so is an inescapable higher level. And the second major change, which is a major change, the conclusion that Hamas, as long as it exists, they're going to try to kill every Jew in the world, and they're certainly going to try to destroy Israel. And therefore, a decision was taken, and I think a correct decision, that in this war we're not just going to defeat them, we're going to kill them. Because again, Bechart B'chaim means that I have a right to kill somebody before he kills me. that having been said, so you put the combination of you're killing now fighters, not just a few leaders, and there's so many civilians mixed in, so you have a much higher civilian casualty rate, despite the fact, I have no proof of this, our grandson works in logistics in the IDF, of the IAF, of the Air Force. I asked him many times, he said, we still have clear rules. You don't attack, you don't target civilian targets. Now he said, it is true that a lot of places that were once civilian targets are not, because there are Hamas people right there and fighters there. But having been said that, in other words, I'm saying is all the classic attempts to save lives are there. It could be that in the first anger and shock and desire to restore deterrence, that they were sloppier, but I think it should be in our minds. It should be bothering us. We should feel bad that the Palestinians, civilians, have these kind of casualties, and we should be making every effort to minimize. In other words, again, I think, okay, I mean, I guess you can talk politics. I think it's clear to me that the government has done, the army and the government has done much more than they say publicly, in part because Smotrich and Ben Gvir want to have Palestinian casualties, and instead of saying we saw the food crisis coming and we started sending food in before the Americans talked about it. They never said that because they did it, but they never said it because they were afraid of these guys. So now it looks like Israel, doesn't care. So my answer is Bרכות בחיים means that we do our best to give life and not to take life. Part of Bרכות בחיים is you have a right to defend your own life. Absolutely. Otherwise, evil wins. That's the whole point of the post-Shoah taking power. We're living in a world where if the good people don't take power, the evil people have unlimited ability to wipe us out. So the responsibility is to take power, and then power is ethical, to kill as few as possible and to keep trying harder and harder. So my final point, I hope, is that the Israeli public, I think, has really responded much more than the government to need, to help, to reinforce those who want life and power. So I'm hoping that eventually, if not sooner, I hope a lot sooner, there will be, elections and a different government, and I hope there will be a much greater, again, I can't generalize, but a few of the people I visited when their sons were killed in the army said that to me, is that at least my son's life should not be wasted, that they should try harder for a better country, for a more humane, more responsible country. No guarantee, but I hope so, and I believe so. And I would finish this way. The Jewish people's record, look what happened in 70 years, with all the flaws. I mean, Ethiopian, where in the world did anybody care about an African life? They spent hundreds of millions of dollars. They got the United States and ourselves to do all these amazing things to save their lives. Now again, they came in, they found they still have discrimination and racism, etc. But that's what covenant's about. An imperfect world, one step at a time. I think the record of 70 years is so amazing that one has a right to say that in the end it will come through, and that the people who choose life will win out, and the people who take responsibility will win out, so that you will not have draft exemptions. You will have people taking responsibility. Stay tuned.
Thank you very much. Professor Grinberg, thank you very, very much. Also, everybody in the whole wide world out there who's listening to us tonight, thank you for attending the annual lecture on Jewish thought, sponsored by the Levin Foundation. We are very happy that you were with us, and we hope we'll see you again next year. Bye-bye.